The air in the dimly lit diner hung thick with the aroma of stale coffee and whispered rumors. Ethan, a man whose skepticism was as ingrained as the lines on his weathered face, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the flickering neon sign outside. "Blackwood Cemetery," he muttered, the name rolling off his tongue like a curse. Another ghost story to add to the town's collection. Sarah, her eyes wide and luminous, held a worn, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with faded ink and chilling. "Tales. It's more than just a story, Ethan," she insisted, her voice barely a whisper. "People have vanished within those gates, never to be seen again. They say the spirits there are restless, tormented." Michael, ever the pragmatist, tapped away on his laptop, his screen displaying a map of the cemetery. According to these local legends, Blackwood was once a thriving community until a series of tragic events decimated the population. Unexplained illnesses, gruesome accidents, and rumors of dark rituals have plagued this place for centuries. David, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, traced a finger along an old newspaper clipping. The most compelling aspect is the rumored existence of a secret cult that operated within the cemetery grounds. Their practices were said to be unorthodox, to say the least. It is said that they tried to pierce the veil between worlds. The conversation fell into a tense silence, the weight of the cemetery's history hanging heavy in the air. Ethan, despite his skepticism, couldn't deny the flicker of unease that stirred within him. "So, you want to explore this place? Tonight?" Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "The full moon will be at its peak. It's the perfect time to uncover the truth." Michael closed his laptop, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "I've got my equipment ready. EMF readers, thermal cameras, voice recorders, everything we need to document any paranormal activity." David adjusted his spectacles, his voice trembling slightly. "I have always been fascinated by the history of Blackwood. This could be our chance to unravel its mysteries." And with a collective nod, they sealed their fate, the promise of a dark adventure echoing in the silence. The diner's bell jingled above the door as they exited, the cool night air nipping at their cheeks as they piled into Ethan's SUV. The destination, Blackwood Cemetery. The engine roared, and the vehicle lunged forward, eating up the miles of lonely road like a beast devouring its prey, the silhouette of the old graveyard already looming in the distance. The SUV rumbled to a stop at the edge of a wrought-iron gate, its rusted bars reaching up like skeletal fingers against the inky sky. Blackwood Cemetery loomed before them, a silent city of the dead shrouded in an unnerving stillness. A full moon, cold and luminous, cast long, distorted shadows across the overgrown landscape. Ethan switched off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of their collective breath. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble, "here we are." Sarah, her eyes fixed on the imposing gate, felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "It's colder than I expected," she murmured, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Michael, already unpacking his equipment, shone a flashlight beam across the weathered stone markers and gnarled trees. "Let's get to work," he said, his voice brimming with a nervous excitement. "We don't have much time before the moon reaches its zenith." David, clutching a worn leather-bound journal, approached the gate, his gaze tracing the intricate designs of its rusted surface. "The gate itself is a marvel," he observed, his voice hushed. "Notice the symbols etched into the ironwork. They bear a striking resemblance to the sigils mentioned in the historical documents I've studied." With a creak that echoed through the stillness, they pushed open the gate, its hinges protesting after decades of disuse. The cemetery path stretched before them, a winding ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the depths of the graveyard. As they ventured deeper, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The moonlight painted the tombstones in stark relief, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted with every gust of wind. Sarah paused, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "I can feel them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're here, all around us." Michael's EMF reader began to emit a series of rapid beeps, its lights flickering erratically. "Something's definitely here," he confirmed, his voice tight with apprehension. "The electromagnetic field is going haywire." David, his flashlight beam sweeping across a row of crumbling tombstones, stopped abruptly. "This one," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "The name, it's familiar." He bent down, brushing away the moss that obscured the inscription. Elias Thorne died 1888, the same name mentioned repeatedly in the journal I've brought. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "They don't want us here," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. The darkness seemed to press in on them, a tangible presence that whispered secrets they weren't meant to hear. With a collective gasp, the group fumbled for their spare flashlights, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness like desperate claws. The sudden blackout amplified the sense of unease, the silence now punctuated by the frantic thumping of their hearts. "Quickly, everyone, regroup." Ethan's voice, though strained, cut through the tension. He shone his light in a wide arc, the beam catching the shimmering droplets of dew clinging to the weathered tombstones. Sarah, her breath ragged, gripped her flashlight tightly, her knuckles white. "I felt something," she stammered, her gaze darting nervously around the cemetery. "Something malevolent." Michael's voice, though trembling, remained steady. "My equipment is still registering anomalies," he said, his flashlight beam illuminating the erratic readings on his EMF meter. "Whatever's here, it's not happy." David, his spectacles slightly askew, shone his light on the opened journal in his hands. The journal, it mentions a series of rituals performed here during the full moon, rituals intended to summon something. A sudden gust of wind, colder than any they had felt before, swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the ancient trees and sending a shiver down their spines. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, unnatural fog began to swirl around them, obscuring the tombstones and creating an eerie, disorienting haze. "Listen," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I can hear them." A faint, ethereal whispering filled the air, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. The whispers were unintelligible, yet they carried a weight of sorrow and rage that sent a chill to the bone. Michael's voice recorder crackled, and a series of distorted, garbled sounds emanated from the device. "I'm picking up EVP," he announced, his voice tight with apprehension. "Electronic voice phenomena, but it sounds corrupted." David, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, shone his flashlight on the open pages of the journal. "The rituals, they involved the sacrifice of innocence," he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. "Children mostly. Their spirits are said to be trapped here, forever bound to this place." As if in response to his words, a series of faint, childish cries echoed through the cemetery, their mournful wails cutting through the stillness of the night. The cries were filled with a desperate longing, a heartbreaking plea for release. Sarah stumbled backward, her eyes filled with tears. "They're suffering," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "They're trapped in a cycle of pain." Suddenly, a cold, clammy hand reached out from the swirling fog, grabbing Sarah's arm with surprising force. She gasped, her flashlight falling to the ground, plunging them into near darkness. A chilling laughter, like the dry rattle of bones, echoed through the cemetery, sending a wave of terror through the group. A collective gasp echoed through the darkness as Sarah cried out, her flashlight clattering to the cracked asphalt path. The sudden absence of light intensified the terror, the inky blackness morphing into a suffocating shroud. Michael, his hands trembling, fumbled for his backup flashlight, the beam cutting through the swirling fog to reveal Sarah's terrified. Her face, her eyes wide with a fear that reflected their own. Sarah! Ethan's voice, strained and urgent, cut through the oppressive silence. He reached out, his hand grasping Sarah's arm, only to recoil in shock. "It's cold," he stammered, his fingers numb, like touching ice. Sarah, her breath coming in ragged gasps, struggled against the unseen force that held her captive. "It's pulling me," she whispered, her voice laced with terror. "It wants me." A series of guttural whispers, like the rustling of dry leaves, filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. The whispers were unintelligible, yet they conveyed a sense of malevolent glee, a chilling anticipation. Michael, his equipment whirring and beeping erratically, shone his flashlight beam across the swirling fog, revealing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving between the tombstones. "The EMF readings are off the charts," he announced, his voice tight with apprehension. "Something's amplifying the energy here." David, his spectacles fogged with fear, clutched the journal tightly, his eyes darting nervously around the cemetery. "The rituals," he murmured, his voice trembling. "They mentioned possession." A chilling laughter, like the dry rattle of bones, echoed through the cemetery, growing louder and more insistent. Sarah's body began to convulse, her limbs jerking uncontrollably. Her eyes rolled back in her head, revealing only the whites, and a guttural growl emanated from her throat, a sound that was both animalistic and inhuman. "Sarah!" Ethan shouted, shaking her violently. "Snap out of it!" But Sarah's eyes, now glowing with an eerie luminescence, fixed on Ethan, and a voice, not her own, rasped from her lips. "She is no longer here. Only the vessel remains." A wave of icy dread washed over the group, the realization dawning that Sarah was no longer herself. A malevolent entity had taken control, using her body as a conduit for its own dark purposes. Michael, his voice trembling, raised his EMF reader, its lights flashing wildly. "The energy signature. It's shifting," he stammered. "It's becoming more concentrated." David, his face pale and drawn, flipped through the journal, his eyes scanning the faded pages. "The ritual," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It requires a sacrifice." A cold, clammy hand reached out from the swirling fog, grabbing Ethan's arm with surprising force. He gasped, his flashlight falling to the ground, plunging them into near darkness once more. The entity within Sarah began to move towards David, her movements unnatural and quick. "The historian holds the key," the possessed Sarah hissed, her voice a distorted mockery of her own. "The knowledge that binds can also break." The air crackled with malevolent energy as the possessed Sarah advanced, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light, her movements unnaturally swift. David, his face etched with terror, stumbled backward, clutching the worn leather journal to his chest as if it were a shield. Ethan, adrenaline coursing through his veins, lunged forward, attempting to grab Sarah, but she sidestepped him with an agility that defied her human form. "Sarah, please, fight it," Ethan pleaded, his voice hoarse, but the entity within her responded. With a chilling laugh, a sound that echoed through the silent cemetery like a death knell. "Foolish mortal," the possessed Sarah hissed, her voice a distorted mockery of her own. "She is gone. Only the vessel remains, and it will serve its purpose." Michael, his hands shaking, aimed his EMF reader at Sarah, the device's lights flashing wildly, emitting a series of high-pitched beeps. "The energy signature is fluctuating," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It's unstable." "The crypt," David gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "The journal mentions a hidden crypt beneath the chapel. That's where it draws its power." With a renewed sense of urgency, The group turned and fled towards the dilapidated chapel, its crumbling stone walls casting long, menacing shadows in the moonlight. The possessed Sarah pursued them, her movements fluid and predatory, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. They reached the chapel's entrance, a gaping maw of darkness, and stumbled inside, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind them with a resounding thud. The interior was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. Michael fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a crumbling altar and a series of cryptic symbols etched into the stone floor. "The crypt entrance," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's hidden beneath the altar." They moved towards the altar, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. As they reached it, they heard a scraping sound coming from below, followed by a heavy stone slab sliding aside, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the floor. "The ritual chamber," David breathed, his voice filled with dread. "This is where they perform their sacrifices." Before they could react, the possessed Sarah burst through the chapel doors, her eyes blazing with fury. She lunged at David, her hand outstretched, her fingers contorted into claws. "The journal!" she shrieked, her voice a guttural growl. "Give it to me!" David, his heart pounding in his chest, held the journal aloft, his eyes filled with desperation. "Never!" he cried, his voice trembling but resolute. "This is the key to stopping you." A spectral wind whipped through the chamber, extinguishing Michael's flashlight and plunging them into darkness. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and the temperature plummeted, sending a shiver down their spines. "The sacrifice is needed. To open the gate," the possessed Sarah growled. "You will all be vessels." Suddenly a small light flickered to life. David had lit a small lighter he carried and began frantically reading aloud from the book. He spoke in a dead language, words of binding and unmaking, of banishment and light. The entities within the possessed Sarah began to scream in pain. The ancient incantations echoed through the crypt, their power resonating against the stone walls. The possessed Sarah recoiled, her spectral form flickering and distorting in the dim light of David's lighter. The entity within her shrieked, a sound of pure agony and rage, as the words of banishment began to take hold. Ethan, seizing the opportunity, rushed forward, grabbing a heavy candelabrum from the altar. He swung it with all his might, striking the possessed Sarah across the head. The impact sent her staggering backward, a groan escaping her lips. For a fleeting moment, Sarah's own eyes flickered into view, filled with confusion and terror. "Ethan, help me," she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. But the moment was fleeting. The entity regained control, its eyes glowing with renewed fury. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice a guttural growl. "The gate will open." Michael, despite his fear, had managed to retrieve his equipment. He aimed his modified EMF reader at the possessed Sarah, the device emitting a high-frequency pulse of energy. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as the energy disrupted its connection to the physical realm. "It's weakening," Michael shouted, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "The energy pulse is destabilizing it." David, his voice hoarse but resolute, continued to read from the journal, the ancient words of banishment filling the crypt with their power. The air grew thick with a sense of otherworldly energy, and the temperature plummeted, sending shivers down their spines. The walls of the crypt began to tremble, and a series of cracks appeared in the stone floor. A low, guttural growl emanated from the darkness beneath, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cemetery. "The gate is opening!" the possessed Sarah shrieked, her voice a distorted echo of its former self. "You cannot stop the inevitable." A swirling vortex of dark energy erupted from the hole in the floor, its tendrils reaching out like grasping claws. The entity within Sarah began to dissolve, its form fading into the darkness. Sarah herself collapsed to the floor, her body limp and lifeless. "Sarah!" Ethan cried, rushing to her side. He cradled her in his arms, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he held her, a chilling realization dawned upon him. Sarah's body was cold, unnaturally so. Her skin was pale and clammy, her eyes lifeless. The entity had abandoned its vessel, leaving behind only an empty shell. "She's gone," Ethan whispered, his voice choked with grief. "She's really gone." This vortex of dark energy continued to swirl, growing stronger with each passing moment. The walls of the crypt trembled violently, and chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling. "We have to get out of here," Michael shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "The crypt is collapsing." They turned and fled, their footsteps echoing through the crumbling tunnels as they raced towards the surface. Behind them, the vortex of dark energy raged, consuming everything in its path. They emerged from the crypt just as the chapel collapsed, the ancient stones crumbling into a pile of rubble. The cemetery was bathed in an eerie glow, the swirling vortex of dark energy illuminating the night sky. The entity had been banished, but at a terrible cost. They had ventured into the heart of darkness, and they had paid the price. They left. Blackwood Cemetery that night, forever changed. They carried the weight of what they had seen, the horror of what they had experienced, and the haunting memory of Sarah, lost to the shadows.